Hello everyone, my name is John Flury. I'd like to welcome you to my very first video tutorial about 3D and photography and how to combine the two so that they match up with regard to perspective and lighting conditions and so forth. I hope you enjoy. We are now in Photoshop and we're looking at the image as it is now completed with detailing in Photoshop. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see that there's a lot of small things that I added in Photoshop. Let me quickly switch off all the other layers and show you just the final render. And maybe click a little bit back and forth here, for example. Right? And the birds, of course. I mean, who would model a bird when you can add it with a bird brush within one click, right? Well, let's take a look back at the first sketch that I did for this project, and it looks a little bit like this. So we're looking at Katniss as she's standing on a sort of railing or a sort of plateau, and she's peering down into this courtyard. And because she has her back turned towards us, we're following her gaze down in this courtyard. One of the techniques I use here is a photographic technique that I really think is one of the most important visual techniques you can use, and it is separation. Separation is basically the contrast building of foreground and background. You see it most pronounced here. Katniss is standing in front of a bright background and she herself is very dark. So she's heavily silhouetted. And what it does to us is we are drawn to this contrast, and that's the first thing we notice in the picture. And when we look here, afterwards our eye starts to wander around and appreciate the rest of the picture, which is exactly what I want. I want the eye to be drawn into that spot. The thing about separation is you can just use tonal separation, which is separation by brightness, but you can also use separation by color. And this is a little bit something I did here. I used blue in the foreground and a reddish tint in the background, which also helps to stage a depth in the scene. When I showed you the initial picture, I'm gonna zoom out a lot. One of the things you'll notice when you switch off all the layers and just show the rendered version is that there's a lot of fog and atmosphere and light streaks. And I have a nice trick for that I'd like to share with you just now. There is a so-called sea depth pass you can render with any render engine, and it encodes the depth information of the 3D scene with black and white. So close objects close to the camera are black, and far away objects in the distance are white, and everything in between is a shade of gray. And you can use this, of course, as a mask, and use this mask then later on to paint in all the clouds and fog and smoke and so on, and it will look really realistical. All right, so now at this point we need to switch over to Cinema 4D, and we need to look at all the information we need in order to shoot this scene in the studio. Okay, you guys, we are now inside of Cinema 4D, and we're looking at the scene the way I modeled it. In order to reproduce the lighting and perspective from our render in the studio, we need to extract some specifications from this project. And most of them are camera related. It's camera sensor size, focal length of the lens, aperture, white balance, as well as a lot of positional data about the camera. You can see that the camera is slightly above the point where Katniss is standing on. If I switch on the camera, you can see that the lines here on the side aren't perfectly vertical, but they're leaning inwards towards the bottom a little bit. And to me, this helps that the viewer gets a little more of a sense of peering down into this courtyard. I want to keep it like that. So yeah, let's look at the camera. Under the object tab here, you have the sensor size. It's essentially right now a full frame camera, and it has a 35mm lens mounted on top. So that's something between a wide angle and a normal lens. And here with this frame border, you can see it's a vertical orientation, a vertical composition. We need to keep that in mind as well for later on. And what else? Here we have the white balance. It's right now set to 6500 Kelvin. I might as well just enter this value in my camera later on, so it's a little bit easier to start with the same values, right? How about aperture? Well, that's here on the physical. It's now on f8, but in this project I didn't use any depth of field, so it's actually irrelevant right now, and I can shoot at a higher f-stop in the studio to make sure that my model is in focus all the way. Now the positional data. That's a little bit of a tricky subject because we need to calculate the camera position. Right now the camera is relative to the point, the 000 point of the scene, and this is way down here somewhere. So for us this isn't very useful right now. I'd like to determine the position of the camera relative to a reference point here, which I suggest is a point between her feet on the ground. And in order to calculate that, we have to create a small little object there and extract the coordinates from this object. I'll start by selecting the plateau. Let me check if that's the right one. Yes. So this is the ground on which our Katniss is standing. I'll quickly align our work plane to this, so you can see that the work plane is now here on top of this plateau. I'll create the cube. The cube is now too big as it usually is. I'll resize it to something like 10, 10, 10. And then I'll move this cube between her feet. Here we go, something like this. Okay, this is now our reference point. So if I select the cube and I go to the coordinates tab, I can use this coordinates here and calculate the difference from the coordinates of the camera. Here we go. And this will give me the exact offset amounts in X, Y, and Z. Before you do this, you have to remember something, and that is your scene actually in the right scale? Let me check that. Is my figure, let me go to the object tab. Yeah, that's what I thought. The figure now is at 1 meter and 15 centimeters. That's too small. And it's very easy to do that. You can scale your whole scene by going here to the mode, then project, scale project. Here enter your current scale of the model and your target scale. Press OK. It will take a little while. So now if I do the calculations, it should be fine. I did that before, and I'm going to switch on an example here. I calculated that our camera has to move to the laterally to the side about 46 centimeters, and then the tripod needs to have a height of around 51 centimeters, and the camera needs to have a distance to the plane of the model of 6 meters and 18 centimeters. So in my studio, that's just about possible, but not much more. So I'm actually in luck that this will work out. Now, if we would shoot this photo just like this, same camera sensor size and same lens and same camera position, we would indeed get something like this. Our model would be as small inside the frame. The problem is, of course, there would be a lot of wasted pixels here. Now, okay, nowadays we have really good sensor resolution, so that's not a huge problem, but I think we can do better. We can use more of our sensor for this. And there's an approach that I'd like to present to you, and it's a so-called distortion template. Let me show you what I mean. I will know that I'm going to shoot my project with a different camera. It's going to be a medium format camera, so it has a longer side of the sensor size here, and I know I'm going to shoot it with a 120mm medium format lens, which is about a 95mm full frame equivalent. And also I leveled out all the pan and tilt aspects here, attributes, I'm sorry. So you see, they're all pointing straight forward. And this is okay, because now I can use the level meter, the spirit meter on my tripod head, point my camera straight, and you see now all the lines are vertical, and the horizontal lines are horizontal as well. This is good, because now I can use this image and create a distortion template. I'm gonna create a screenshot. You don't have to render anything for this approach, just make a screenshot here. Then I'm gonna move over to Photoshop here, and I'm gonna import this screenshot. Right now, the lines, the vertical and the horizontal lines don't match up. And I need to distort my screenshot until they match up. In order to see this a little better, I'm gonna change the opacity to 50%. So now I'll change the size to be in the ballpark already. Yeah, something like this. And then I right click inside the transform window, choose distort, and start pulling these edges until they line up. You will have to do this a couple of times, because every time I move a point, the other points change a little bit as well. Right. And to make this a little bit easier for us, I'm going to create a solid color layer on top with a clipping layer here. Change this to multiply and a little less, a little brighter. Here we go. So this will be our distortion template. If we shoot our picture now in the studio with the medium format camera and this 120mm lens that I talked about, I can import the image here in Photoshop and re-distort my photo to the same dimensions. And as long as my photo's edge points match up with this distortion template, the perspective inside will be just fine. But there's a last thing we need to look at in our Cinema 4D here, and it's the lighting, right? So you see there's a lot of lights in here, but most of them are irrelevant for us because they're pointing a different direction. They're not pointing at our model. Important is just the spotlight, the rim light, some red light from the city pointing up, and some general ambient light, which is a dome light wrapping around the whole scene. Now, these four lights are important. And to make it a little more easier for you guys, I rendered each light separately, and we are gonna look at what each individual light does. So the first one will be the spotlight. You see, it's a hard light source, no soft transition between bright and shadow, and it's coming from above, and it's pointing towards her. Maybe it's a little bit on the left side because her shadow, you see it here, is leaning a little bit to the right side. The second light is going to be coming from a similar angle, and it's a soft light this time. You can see the transition is much softer, the shadow is softer, and I'm thinking this is gonna be probably a Elinchrom 100cm octabox or something like this. Whereas the first light, the spotlight, I think I might use a beauty dish with a grid on top. All right, next one will be a light that comes from below. First of all, you can see it has a reddish tint, and it will illuminate our model very subtly from below. You can see on her hand there's a little bit of red glow, and on her side, and if she stretches out her hand, it will also have the underside will have this red lighting. Now there is one problem with this light, and I can't actually place the light lower than my studio floor, right? But it should be down here. Now, why is that important? If you know a little bit about the inverse square law, you know that the closer a model is to the light source, the bigger there is a light fall off. You can see that here. Initially that's very strong, but it falls off very quickly, and then this fall off over distance becomes more gradual. In fact, if you look at the graph, you can see the first couple of centimeters that the fall off is dramatical. But after a while the fall off becomes slower, and with distance, this is the distance scale here, it becomes very gradual. We have to keep this in mind here. So our model is standing here, and if our light would be on the floor, her ankle and maybe her lower leg would be very bright, but the fall off would be dramatic, and until the light reaches her head and arms, there wouldn't be hardly any light left. So we have to cheat. And we're going to cheat the light rays by placing a mirror on the ground. We're going to place a mirror in front of her here, and we're going to shine a light with a snoot from top, going to shine it into the mirror. It will reflect and bounce on her. And like this, the distance from her to the light source will be much greater, and the fall off won't be that great. So that's a nice way to cheat the light beams into thinking the distance is much longer. By the way, I opened now the fourth light I'm gonna use, and this is the dome light. You see in the scene, it is all the way around our scene, and it shines in through all the nooks and crannies. It's also an important light because it will also slightly illuminate the shadows on her. Most of that is visible here on the side, and I might even use a separate strip light on the side with a grid to shine it on her side like this. But even more importantly, I think, will be to place some styrofoam sheets on this side and a styrofoam sheet on this side, just to illuminate the shadows ever so slightly. So we have a little bit of detail. It doesn't have to be much, but just a little bit of shadow detail here on her backside. Okay. Yeah, one last thing. You see, she's standing on a metal grill. And you notice if we shine a light into this metal grill, it will spread, it will also reflect some light. And so I'm gonna have my models standing on a reflector, a standard, like a studio reflector, silver, and that's gonna help to give the impression of her standing on a metal grill. So that's it. Let's now go to the studio and check out the lighting. Alright, well, after a great shoot with Jasmin together, we had a really great afternoon doing this and a lot of fun. I'm happy to show you in Photoshop the next steps we need to take in order to, match the photo to the 3D background. Okay, first step is of course selecting the image that we want to use, and my tip would be not to simply look for the best image of the series, but also look at the other parts of the image that need to be selected. Like here, of course, it's the cat. So these two need to work together in concert well. That's more important than each individual one looks their very best. They have to work together. Story is more important than individual beauty, period. So, but let's leave away our cat for a second, because I just want to show you what I did on the model, on Katniss, or Jasmin, the model. So I selected her, I placed her, and I masked her out. So I created this mask. I'm not going to talk about masking. There's a lot of other tutorials how you can do that. But then the next step would of course be the perspective. And you know, I made a big deal out of we create a distortion template in order for the vertical lines to match up. Well, I sort of broke my own rule. I didn't do anything. I didn't adjust the perspective according to that template. I felt that it just looks better when she's undistorted, even though it's not technically a correct way of for her. It just looks nicer. And looking at sometimes at what digital painters do, they sort of cheat the system a little bit as well with the lighting and with the perspective. And just if something looks better and it's still believable, yeah, you're fine. So that's what I did. There are a couple of steps in my workflow now, and just a quick run through. So the first one was the culling and selecting, then the masking, and now the perspective, which we don't really change a lot. But the next steps are important as well. That's the contrast and then the color. It's important that the two don't mix. So if you work on the contrast, you only work on the contrast, and vice versa if you're working on the color. Then after this, some light retouching where necessary. I do this kind of late in these sorts of projects because it's basically only after matching color and contrast that I can say that's the image I want to work with in this composite. So it's important not to start too much and put too much work into retouching. Of course, the shadow is important as well. Right now I have a little bit of a shadow, but that's actually the shadow from the 3D stick figure I had in place there. And I need to redraw this shadow. We need to adjust this. So that's what we're going to do. And the last step, it's going to be to just add some effects. For example, this light streak from above, I want to have this light streak over Katniss as well. So to have a little bit of continuance in there. Also, I would like to have the light behind her wrap around her body a little bit to create a sort of, a little bit of a rim light of effect. That a little bit of maybe like a flare, like a lens flare around her. And the last one is going to be one of my special tricks, my secret sauce, so to speak. And we're going to talk about that last. Okay, so we're now working with the contrast. That's the next step. Let's quickly take a step back and change everything to black and white. And now immediately you sort of can see the problem. Katniss is too dark. It doesn't look right. If she's standing here, she should have a dark value not much darker than here, the back of these pipes, or maybe here, the back of this wheel. She can't be as black and as dark as she is now, right? Reason for that is, one, there's some atmosphere, some air particles in between the camera and Katniss, and the light shines in to this space, so there's a little bit of graying out of the tonal values from the camera to her. And yeah, the other reason is we have a lot of fill light, maybe more fill light than I intended when I shot this in the studio. So I need to take this into account as well. So that's the first step. Let's change the contrast. And let's do this with a separate layer, contrast layer. So the blending mode should only be luminosity. Let's not change the colors. I'm going to leave everything in black and white so we can judge this a little bit better and not be distracted by the colors. And that's what I did here. I raised the black point considerably. Let me show you here. I just pushed the black points a lot until it looked right to my eyes. Right? On the top, I just reduced the contrast a little bit by dragging down the white point. So overall, there is less contrast on her. One reason for that is she is wearing a black dress, and black is a little bit of a problem sometimes for us photographers. So I had to push the black point considerably. But on the other hand, her face is, well, she has quite she has pretty skin, but it's very bright. So what I did on her face is the opposite. I reduced the brightness on her face. So that's what it looks like. I just, just in the middle tonal values, I dragged that down a little bit. Also, just luminosity, that layer as well. So now that the contrast looks great, we can switch off the black and white layer here. By the way, that's just a white solid layer, and I just changed the blending mode to saturation. So, quick way of doing it. Colors. All right. What can I say about the colors? To me, what always felt a little bit off was that her skin tone is a little bit too orange, a little bit too red. It just doesn't fit into the picture yet as well. It sort of pops out, especially the pink in the highlights here. And so I had to change that, as well as the highlights on her armor, if you want to call that. The highlights are a little bluish, but they should actually be a little reddish, because the surrounding highlights are sort of a red magenta tone. So oftentimes what I do here, I switch on the information layer and I sort of hover around the background and I look at these values here, the RGB, and sort of try to see, okay, so there's a little bit more red than green and a little bit less blue, and I sort of try to keep this ratio of values in mind when I push my colors. Let me switch on my layer. So you see basically here I just added some warmth to the mid-tones, a little bit to the highlights as well. So the surrounding red tint is also a little bit more on her. But her face and her hair and the bow, what do you call it, the feathers, it just feels too saturated. So that's the next step I did. I did desaturate everything quite a bit. And yeah, and I think after desaturating, I changed the desaturation overall, but a lot in the reds. Yeah, a lot in the red channel. Yeah, okay. So now I think it matches much, much better. Right? Don't you think? So if I go back, compare it to what we had in the beginning, if it updates somewhere in the future, or maybe the contrast as well. So that's the beginning, contrast, and color. Color is very subtle, but color is difficult as well. That's why I do it on different layers, just to have a little bit more control over it. It takes some time to fix the colors. Okay, next after color we talk about a little bit about the retouching. I didn't have to do a whole lot of retouching here because she's so far away from the camera. We don't see any pores or skin blemishes, so basically the retouching layer I think is pretty empty. Yeah, but I did a little bit of touching and burning. Here you can see it, just popping out the highlights a little more, maybe adding some highlights where I wanted some, like here on the bow there's a highlight that's stronger than it is in real in the photo, but I wanted to have a little bit more separation to the background here as well. Separation, again, very important. All right, so that's the retouching, and the next step would be the shadows. I don't intend to talk a lot about the shadows today, but it's basically I'm using a layer in the multiply blending mode, and I'm brushing in with a low opacity brush so that until it looks good. And because I already had rendered in a shadow, I sort of had an idea of what the tonal value of the shadow should be. And you still can see the edge a little bit, but really I don't care. Here I'm so far away. If our picture is like this, nobody's really looking at those couple of pixels here exactly. So I didn't really pay a lot of attention to the shadows here. a little bit more, maybe some more darkening, and I even did something that's maybe not necessary. I added a shadow here on the other side. I thought that she would throw a shadow from where she's standing to this other edge. It's maybe not necessary, but I did it, so I left it in. And to finish, after the shadows, there's some effects. Just quickly, there is the light streak here itself. You can see this light area. I copied it on top of Katniss here and just added it at a low opacity to 6%, right? And because it's all these layers, these adjustment layers are all clipped to the photo. Here, that's the photo. So the mask from the photo is in effect for all these other layers as well, right? So that's the light streak. And you see it's just a subtle effect, a little bit of a flare maybe there as well. The next one would be a bloom effect. And I have to be honest, I don't know if it's called a bloom in other areas, but in computer graphic it's called bloom, and it's when a bright light wraps around and creates a sort of flare around the dark edge. You can see it here. And I basically did this by taking the whole image, grabbing my mask from the photo of Katniss, inverting it, and then blurring that mask. And after these steps, if you blur it, you can see that this surrounding brightness is sort of overlapping her. And because I only want to have this effect by brightening the image, I changed the blending mode to screen, right? So that's what I did here, sort of effect. The mask now looks something like this. It's blurry, except black, where I sort of didn't want the effect to be as strong on her face. The blooming looked distracting, and her features didn't look right anymore. So yeah, that's this. The very last step is my secret sauce, like I promised you, and it's something very simple, but I do this in almost every photo I do. And it's actually just desaturating the shadows. Oftentimes, what I don't like about an image is that my eye is drawn to the saturation in the shadows. And I want my eye more to be drawn to the light sides of an image, to the bright sides of an image. So I desaturate the shadows selectively. And I'm using a tool called Lumensia. This is a tool that creates luminosity masks. So that's a mask that is based on the luminosity of a picture. Let me show you what I mean. This is not going to be a tutorial about luminosity masks at all, but I make a quick example here. For example, this is a dark luminosity mask. So it selected everything that is dark to deep dark to maybe medium dark. The other ones, the D2, 3, 4, that's more sharp fall-offs. Like here, it only selects the very, very dark areas, almost the blacks. For me, if I want to desaturate the shadows and maybe darker midtones, I went for something in between. The D2, that's a nice mixture of really the deep blacks, as well as here some midtones. I'm gonna use this mask and use it on a hue saturation layer by clicking on that button, and it creates a new hue saturation layer for me, and it will copy that mask that I'm happy with now over, and here it is. So all I have to do now is reduce the saturation, and mostly it's saturation in the red channel, so I start here most of the times. I reduce it, and now it's already better. Let me go back and maybe go closer. Now that's without, and that's with. It's very subtle. I'm not sure if on YouTube you're gonna see the difference very well, but me here sitting at the monitor, for me it's quite obvious. So the red channel is the one that I needed to drag down. If I still needed to have a little more desaturation, maybe not just in the red tones, I change maybe the master saturation slider a little bit as well. So I am happy with this. Let's also add our little kitty buddy here next to Katniss, and I think this image looks great the way it is. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial as well, and I hope you could learn something that helps you to match your colors, perspective and lighting a little bit more for the future projects you do, and I wish you a lot of luck with them.